So my name's only my bank manager and my wife call me Dr. Steve Marritt. I'm Steve to most people. So I'm here to talk about church, state and feudal society, 1066 to 1406. My daughter has just finished her hires and did her Nat 5s the year before. She never did anything like this topic. All the books she has, How to Pass Your Hires, doesn't have anything on this topic. So I took as my starting point the higher course specification, which has these themes, and then I looked at the past papers and the marking guidance for 2019 and 2018 in an attempt to try and focus on what you guys might find useful rather than medieval historians pontificating about stuff. And the first thing I spotted was this is an enormous topic. This is something that at university level we would be looking at over 2 years or something. So it's a huge ask for your students to do it. And I also noticed that the exam questions are really, really much harder than what we would have. In 2019, they're quite big general ones, but in 2018, they get very, very specific about the civil war of King Stephen's reign. So it's a huge task to try and manage this, I think. And what I thought I'd start with were some kind of key issues. They're not necessarily things you can do anything about. As the dad of a child who's done higher in Nat 5 in the past couple of years, looking up teaching resources online, and my wife was once a primary school teacher as well. So I know how hard it is to find teaching resources, and when you look up teaching resources for this topic, it's really difficult to find stuff. There is stuff in England through A-levels and various places like that, but a lot of it is aimed at primary school children and castles and knights and that kind of thing. So there is a limited amount of stuff out there to make your lives easier. So that was one thing I noted. The second thing I think, which is common to medieval history, whether you teach it at school or at university, is the difficulties around primary sources. You know, everything's written in Latin. So where do you find the stuff in translation? What kinds of primary sources can you use to engage with your students and your pupils? I'll come on to that further on today. There are actually some really brilliant resources out there which are relatively easily accessible. The third thing I spotted was the word feudalism. And if any of you have done medieval history at university, you'll know that feudalism is a nightmare word for us. And when we use it with our students, unfortunately, I don't know if it happens at school, but they latch onto that word. And however much we tell them that it's a complicated word, they can't escape it. And I know you guys probably don't have the power to change the title of the section in the higher paper, but I wonder if you might think about it. Feudalism as a word has been a problem for historians since the 1970s. I know in the higher specification it says that this is a topic of debate, and it really is, but these days, in a way, we've moved beyond that debate. It was first questioned in a classic article, which is available to everybody, by a lady called Elizabeth Brown in 1974, The Tyranny of a Construct. And it does still have a kind of tyrannical role over how our world is dominated. And what Elizabeth Brown pointed out way back in 1974 was that if you go back to the evidence, rather than assuming that what you've read in all the secondary history by scholars, then you find it's actually really hard to find evidence that feudalism really exists. And so that pyramid that I put up on the right, the classic primary school feudal pyramid, it is really difficult to find examples of that. The classic idea of feudalism, that you have everybody holds their land from the king and everybody holds that land for military service, is something which somehow has got into people's brains and is very difficult to get out of it. And what most modern historians, I think, would use instead of the word feudalism, and if they ever use feudalism, as I've done correctly here, you put it in inverted commas, is we look at the word lordship. A relationship between a superior and an inferior, which is based on notions of service, yes, but also loyalty, protection, reward, and chivalry eventually. So something which is more amorphous, but is also more emotional and more based in ritual and more based in personal contact, maybe, than land. One of the classic ways we illustrate things like lordship is royal seals. What you see down on the bottom right should be the seals of David I of Scotland and Alexander I of Scotland, as they were kind of slightly invented by 19th century illustrators from the survivals of medieval seals, which tend to be very rubbed out. If you'd come to England under the Anglo-Saxons, the seal would only have been the left-hand image, the king enthroned. The Norman dukes had a seal that only had the right-hand image, the knight on his horse. And the Norman ducal power was much less than that of a king. And it was really that he was the first among equals. So for him, his ability to create personal bonds of lordship with individual aristocrats was crucial. And when the Normans become kings of England, and then the kings of Scotland copy their seals, when in the 12th century, what they do is they put those two things together. So you have royal power and you have lordship, and the seal is a classic example of that. So the word scholars tend to use now is lordship. And one of the problems with feudalism has always been England. And I know I'm English and everything's our fault. England is different from everywhere else in the whole of Europe in this period, because William the Conqueror conquers England, and that gives him a blank slate with which he can do anything. So what he does is he creates an entirely new social structure and tenurial, as in who holds land from who structure, that didn't exist in Normandy and never would exist in Normandy, and couldn't exist in Scotland either, because when the kings of Scotland exist in a world that is already there rather than a new world, and didn't exist in France. And the history of feudalism has been dominated by English historians or American historians talking about England. But even there, way back in the 1980s, in 1981, a great historian called John Gillingham, who when I was first a student, we used to go to this conference. It sounds like something from the 1960s, and you all had to play cricket with them in the sun at the outside Battle Abbey down in Hastings. It was a very different world. He pointed out that the whole basis of the idea that the King of England, William the Conqueror, had created this society where all his nobles held land in return for military service was based on 5 documents, none of which is more than a paragraph long. And in this classic 1981 article, which isn't available online, but there's a great Prezi in there which is based on it, he took each of those documents apart and he showed that not one of them actually demonstrated what historians had claimed to that point it did demonstrate. None of them used the word fief, for instance. None of them used any version of the word feudalism. And what he showed was this system, which historians and websites, and we all have come to believe existed, developed very, very gradually over a long period of time, and was developed out of a process of negotiation between kings and aristocrats. And I'm going to come back to that as one of the main themes of what I want to talk about today. Another problem with feudalism is that nobody in the Middle Ages used those terms. So we're applying this word to a community which never thought in those terms. If you were to ask what the medieval thinkers thought about the structure of their society, they would talk about the 3 orders: those who pray, the same guys who were writing, the thinkers, the priests, the monks, those who fight, the aristocracy, and the kings. And note, in this model, the king is in the middle, and those who work. That's the way they would have thought about it, not about feudalism. The other problem with feudalism, the really big problem with feudalism, is there are no women in feudalism. If you look at the classic model of feudalism, and to be honest, if you look at the higher course specification, there are no women in that structure. And starting in the 1980s, historians of women and gender in this period began to think that instead of having 3 orders or this feudal system, actually women existed in a completely different group, because their lives were to some extent governed by their biological, where they were in a biological chronology, if you like. You were treated differently if you were a child, if you were a teenager, if you were married, if you were a widow, if you were of childbearing age. So you might be, if something in the early Middle Ages where there was a weregild system, where a kind of set of fines for crimes, often the fines for crimes against a woman would depend on her age and whether she was married or a widow. So what historians started to argue in the 80s, and still do, is that feudalism as a structure doesn't really allow for a place for women. And as I say, I'm not sure yet that the higher court spec allows for that either. So they're kind of big key issues, I think, that are worth being aware of when you're teaching this topic. If I go to my next screen, the other big issue is primary sources. They are difficult to find, but there are actually brilliant primary sources out there for this topic, freely available. If any of you did medieval history as a student, you will have come across the Internet Medieval Sourcebook, which has sources ranging from the early Middle Ages in the Balkans to the Black Death and the Renaissance, from scholarship through heresy. It has an enormous range of material, including quite a lot on the period that is covered in this topic. And it's all free and it's all in English, which is great. The other great source for historians who are teaching this topic is a book called English Historical Documents, which was a series of books published as long ago as the 1980s, when publishers could afford to do this. And what they are is they are about this thick, and they are translations into English of medieval documents. It's often easy to find medieval chronicles in translation, but if you were looking for royal records, if you were looking for private documents between individuals, or you were looking for some kind of government text like Doomsday Book or Magna Carta, before these volumes came out, you would have really struggled. These volumes have things like the constitutions of town government. They have extracts from royal taxation rolls. They have grants by an individual to a monastery saying why they're giving land to that monastery. Now, these books these days, I just looked it up on Amazon before I came on. You'd be looking at £3,000 for English historical documents too. They are worth their weight, literally, in gold. But they're free on a website called archive.org. And archive.org has been a real boon to people who teach medieval history, because it puts up material that is out of copyright. And so it has these volumes, which are just the basis for any study of primary sources if you don't have Latin in this period, with commentary. They're just wonderful. You could spend days reading these, put them on a bedside table and read it. They also have lots of chronicles. And in the 19th century, there was a real boom in translating chronicles, medieval chronicles, into English. There must have been a market for it. A classic one for us would be the Church Historians of England, translated by Joseph Stevenson, which comes in something like 5 volumes and has all the main chronicles for this period, including in volume 4, the first proper translation of the Chronicle of Melrose. And volume 4 is all the Scottish chronicles from this period, despite the title being the Church Historians of England. It also has on archive.org a whole series of things called Bohn's Antiquarian Translation, B-O-H-N. And Bohn was a publisher in the late 19th century who brought out kind of penny editions of medieval chronicles. So there's a huge range of those. Now, the print tends to be quite small, but they're really very, very useful. And of course, one of the great things about teaching medieval history at university, and probably at school as well, is you can't just use printed sources. You have to use illustrations and examples of artifacts, texture, archaeology, that kind of thing. So, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's go back to the, didn't mean to do that. Let's go back to the PowerPoint if we can. Oh dear, how do I do that? Right, I might just have to stop my share and come off that accidental web page and then go back on. Give me a minute. Right, let's try that again. Okay, so where's the PowerPoint? There's the PowerPoint. Right, so sorry about that. So if we go through to here, so one of the things that we're doing increasingly at universities is moving beyond just dull bits of text and looking at artifacts and architecture. And the internet is a huge resource for that kind of thing, of free material. So I was just going to go through these to give you examples of how we might use them. So the one right in the top middle, I've already said how women are not necessarily a part of the higher course spec, but if you were to use a male knight's seal or the royal seal, like I've just shown you, how you might use that to represent power and authority in the Middle Ages, the same goes for noble women. This is a 12th century knightly woman's seal, and she's pictured in the classic way that aristocratic women are represented to display their status. And sometimes these women are on horseback, and almost always they are holding a hawk as a classic representation of aristocratic authority and power. And I thought I'd put another woman in this as well to give you an example. Down at the bottom right, there's a whole section in the higher course spec on the church. And one way to think about the church in this period is that it provides opportunities for women to have power and authority which are absent in everyday life or noble life. So this person down, if you look at the person second in from the right, who has a kind of red river coming down to her mouth, this is an abbess in Germany called Hildegard of Bingen. And that is the Holy Spirit. The red kind of stream is the Holy Spirit inspiring her. And Hildegard in the 12th century was a major political figure. She was an advisor to popes and emperors and kings. Often they asked her for moral advice rather than political advice, but she wasn't ashamed of giving them political advice as well. She was a great scholar. As an abbess, she ruled a monastery of hundreds of nuns. So there's a whole world of women in the church, which is fascinating. And she's a good example of it. Another element of the church, which is really important to women in my period, is that in the 12th century is the first time the church says, if you get married, you have to get married in the presence of a priest. And that allows proportions of women, at least, to finally have an element of choice and decision. And we start to get large numbers of women, relatively large numbers of women, recorded as saying no, because now they're getting married in the presence of a priest. If they say no in the presence of the priest, then there is a problem with the marriage. So you see changes of that kind. You see the growth of the cult of the Virgin Mary takes off massively in the 12th century, becomes central to religious life, and that allows women to have a more central place in the church. Hildegard and her other nun are coloured in blue. These are colours associated with the Virgin Mary. So there's a whole world out there you can explore of ways that women possess authority and status. The noble woman here with the falcon, she has the right to use her own seal, which means she can issue her own documents, which suggests that she's possessed of land and status and has freedom to choose what she does with those things. So in that sense, artifacts can be really valuable. If we stick with the church still, you know, if you've done any medieval history at all or lived in Scotland at all, you know what a Lewis chessman is. One of the interesting things about the church in the 12th century is that the bishop is a product of the late 12th century in chess. There is no bishop before the late 12th century. The first bishops we see as chess pieces are the Lewis chessmen and other chessmen being produced in Scandinavia in the late 12th century, where their bishops were brand new, just like bishops are coming into play in England and Scotland in the 11th and 12th centuries as part of the power structure. In Norway and other parts of Scandinavia, that happens in the late 12th century. So it must have somehow seeped into the consciousness of the people who are playing and creating chess pieces, that they take one of the major figures of that game and turn him in and represent him as a bishop, rather than as, I actually can't remember what he was before, an elephant or something like that. Again, another good example, if you look at the bottom left, you can see this is Lincoln Cathedral in England, a classic Norman conquest cathedral. One of the key themes of the church I've noticed in the higher course spec is the church and politics and government. The Norman bit of this is the west front of Lincoln. It looks across the square from this is the castle. So when the Normans conquered Lincoln, they built a castle on one side on top of the hill and the cathedral on the other side. And they moved the cathedral the diocese, the bishopric of Lincoln, was huge. It covered most of eastern England, and the bishopric, when the Normans came, was quite far down south, nearer London. The Normans realised that Lincolnshire, part of the Danelaw, was a major strategic site, so they moved the bishopric and its site from the south of England up to the north. And the key bit here is, if you look at Lincoln Cathedral, you'll see that right in the middle, there's this different architecture, which is a kind of rectangle. And it's surrounded by these little niches where in the later Middle Ages, there would have been saints which got lost at the Reformation, destroyed at the Reformation. But the original bit is the kind of plain architecture. And what architectural historians have done with this is they've said, if you look at this as it must have been built in the 1090s, it looks a heck of a lot like a castle. And so it's a classic example of a bishop as a political power and part of the government structure of a new kingdom, which is part of the higher cross spec. Castles, of course, you can find 10 a penny on the web. This is the Tower of London, William the Conqueror's first stone castle. Modern historians of castles these days, if you look at this, this has massive windows. Why would you have a massive window in a castle? And historians of England in particular have moved away from thinking of castles as just about defense to thinking of castles as ways to represent power. You don't need big windows if this is a way to say I'm the king. And if you look at the architecture, lots of these castles with this particular Romanesque style are supposed to be aping Roman classical architecture. So it's a way to express your authority. And you can do that with hundreds of these things. On the top left, you've got coins. There is masses of material on the web on coins. If you've done David I, you know that these are the first silver coins minted in Scotland. So it's a way to show the increase of royal power and the growth of royal power, and so on and so on. So artifacts and architecture and illustration, and you always put the Bayeux tapestry up on the right. I've noticed that in the higher course spec, it talks about aristocrats living comfortable lives. Yes, they do, but if you want to think about the medieval male aristocracy, especially in the central Middle Ages, you have to think of them as born to fight. They are bred from birth to be warriors. It's what they want to do. It's how they want to exist. It's a natural way of life for them. It's what partly explains the turbulence of the world that these guys live in. So these are really useful examples. I've put down at the bottom right, just to kind of finish with these things. This is a late 12th century image of Christ. Now, if you were at the start of the 12th century, you would see the classic kind of Byzantine image of Christ that you can buy in shops on wee wooden plaques, the kind of Greek imperial Christ with the gold and the purple and so on and so on. One of the changes that happens in the church in the 12th century is that Christ comes to be represented as a human, as somebody in pain and in suffering. And the course spec for the higher talks a lot about monasteries as places that normal people can have their prayers said and so on. That's true for the elite, but for your average guy like you and me, unless you're all nobles or royals, the Christ we would be experiencing, the life we would experience, the connection we might try and make with Christ and the Virgin is more likely to be this. So the church is offering something not just to the elites, but it's also able to express the religious beliefs of the laity. So Christ becomes humanized and closer to people in the 12th century. So what I thought I'd do, I know I'm kind of going to run out of time in a minute. I thought I'd take one example of the spec and sort of approach it from how modern historians would approach it. One of the themes of the higher program is the growth of central government in the 12th century. And this is also a theme of modern scholarship, has been forever. Henry II famously is supposed to have invented the common law. John in Magna Carta is supposed to have been rolled back from the overbearing power of the king. Historians over the past kind of 20 years have started to look again at the nature of this power. People began to question whether somebody like Henry II could have thought, I think the common law is a brilliant idea, let's invent it. They've started to think about, Henry I, who under Henry I, the Exchequer, the modern Exchequer, was invented, and this shows how it works here. The Exchequer originates in a big checkered tablecloth, and it is thought that the abacus from Arab scholars living in England, or people in England, scholars living in England who'd met Arab scholars, they brought the abacus back, and this, with the Exchequer, this checkered tablecloth, revolutionized tax gathering. So twice a year, the sheriff of each county would go to Winchester, and the checkered tablecloth would be laid out, and the king's men would lay out in coins on their side, in the different blocks on the checkered cloth, what they were expecting the sheriff to bring in from the county. And the sheriff would then have his bags of pennies, and he would lay them out on his side. And if the two sides didn't match, woe betide the sheriff. So there, and William the Conqueror famously, of course, came up with Domesday Book. So from one side, and traditionally, it looks like these kings are administrative geniuses, that they come up with these brilliant ideas, which then change the world they're living in. And there may be some truth to that, but historians, as I say, for the past 20 years have begun to look for why these things are produced and what they come out of. Domesday Book is a classic example. It looks like it developed from taxation records which were already kept, and it looks like it developed out of a number of questions and worries that the king had about the power of his aristocracy, because he simply didn't know the levels of power and wealth that the new Normans had. He didn't even know his own resources. So following a thwarted invasion from Scandinavia, it looks like William I panicked and said, we need to find out how much wealth I have, how powerful my aristocracy is, and how do we do that? So we use old mechanisms that the Anglo-Saxons have invented, and we put all that stuff together. And I keep saying looks like, because we don't actually know why Domesday Book was created. Nobody at the time wrote down why it was created. Everything that's ever been said about Domesday Book is built out of inference. And that's key, because Domesday Book doesn't actually work as a document. It works for people today who want to find out what their town was like in England back in 1068 or something. But at the time, the way it's structured when it's put together, it's completely unusable by anybody. If you were looking for the taxation details of an individual, you couldn't find it. If you were looking for how much power a particular aristocrat had across the whole country, impossible. So one of the reasons historians have been debating this topic for 100 years, why was Domesday Book created, is because you can't use it. So the men that create these documents often don't quite understand what it is they're doing or conceptualize of the things that they are creating. Henry I, William's son, famous for his government brilliance, the Exchequer, I've mentioned that, and using sheriffs in the counties. Now, this is often held up as a brilliant government mechanism, but Henry I wanted cash. Henry I's sole motive for all of this is to bring in more money to the centre, because Henry I has to spend a lot of money out in Normandy and in England to maintain his position. So government for him isn't about administrative development. It's not about justice. It's not about sheriffs and civil servants. It's about cash. How do I get the cash? And he uses the science of the time to get the most cash he can. Henry II, as I say, is supposed to have invented common law. Henry didn't invent the common law. He's more interested in his wife and fighting and invading places and hunting, not got the time to invent the common law. The common law comes out of demand. There's a civil war in England in the 1130s to the 1150s, and after that, there are lots of disputes. And Henry's government, not Henry himself, have to try and work out a way to deal with those. And one of the problems they have is, if person X comes to you and says, person Y took this away from me in the Civil War, what are you going to do about it? You're now in a peaceful world, and you've got to come up with a way to settle this without seeming to be on the side of one or the other. You've got to be neutral. So what Henry starts to do is his government starts to say, okay, I can't fix this. I don't know what happened in Yorkshire in 1143. How am I supposed to know? I'm going to send it back to the county. And the writs which form the common law, and you might have heard these phrases, novel disseisin and mort d'ancestor, who held it last, they all come out of a practice whereby Henry tried to send these problems back to the localities. People in the localities then realized, hang on, this is brilliant. If I can get a writ from the king, I can actually use that as some kind of proof of my right. So the common law develops out of a demand from outside for what people come to see as legal documents proving their right to land, rather than from the king himself saying, right, these are the new laws, this is what we're going to do. So historians have started to think about things in these terms, and that impacts considerably on when you get to Magna Carta and John. John's dad, Henry, had also had a thing called the Rotuli de Dominabus et Pueris et Puellis, which is the role of ladies and boys and girls. And Henry, as the lord, not feudal superior, but lord of the aristocracy, as the lord of somebody, if they die, you have the right to determine who will be the guardian of their children until they grow up. And that guardian will also potentially have rights over who female children will marry. You also, as the king of those you are the immediate lord of, you have the right to decide whether their widows will marry, or if there's a widowed lady who is the heiress to something, you have the right to decide if she should marry somebody or if she should be allowed to stay unmarried again. So Henry II comes up with this roll, which is a medieval government documents were kept on parchment, which was stitched so that you'd have one bit of parchment, then another bit of parchment, then another bit, all stitched below each other. And then you roll them up and you store them in wee kind of ducats as rolls. That's why they're called rolls. As a list of the people that he could marry off, or a list of the people he could find guardians for. So like Henry I with the Exchequer, Henry's interest in his aristocracy is about money. He is interested in who these people marry because he wants to sell it off. And what we see with Magna Carta is that the aristocracy have had enough of this process. But it's important to be aware that Magna Carta comes out of not something that John just came up with. There has been conflict between the king and his aristocracy and negotiation between the king and his aristocracy ever since William the Conqueror comes to England in 1066. There's constant jockeying for who should have independence, how much authority should this king have over me. So Domesday Book comes out of that process. The Exchequer comes out of that process. The common law comes out of that process. The role of ladies and boys and widows comes out of that process. So rather than these kings trying to invent new forms of central government, they're interested in money. And as part of that process, new forms of central government, sometimes by accident, occur. And at the same time as that's taking place, you have constant tension. So we tend to think, when we think of Henry II and Henry I and William the Conqueror after Domesday, and even right up to John, as being some kind of time of relative peace in England, apart from the civil war of Stephen's reign. But if you actually look at England in this period, you will find that there is war and tension almost all the time. There are very few periods where there is a long stretch of peace in England and Normandy. And that is all to do with the jockeying for control and autonomy of the king and the aristocracy. And that means that I've put lots of the stuff for this on the right-hand side, but it means that when you're thinking about central royal power, there are different ways to consider that to the ways the traditional core spec is wanting you to consider it. The relationship between king and aristocracy is much more one of negotiation and compromise and debate all the time, not just at Magna Carta, than it is before then. And that has started to have an impact on how we understand David of Scotland, the traditional, well, my favourite Scottish king. The traditional Davidian revolution, that one where he transforms everything in Scotland, recent work, which is summarised, unfortunately very little of this is available online, But Richard Oram has summarized a lot of this in his recent biography of David. Oram has produced 2 biographies of David. One came out in the early 2000s and it's quite brief. This one is much more useful for you. You could teach a whole course on David first with that book. Unfortunately, it's only available in hardback at the moment, but hopefully it'll come out in paperback just now, because what he does is he pulls together the way that historians in Scotland have been doing what historians in England have been doing. And they've been trying to work out, how much do we really believe these ideas that these men are revolutionaries, these kings? They come up with entirely new ideas. Are there other ways when we go back to the evidence to explain how things develop? And often it is accidents, it's not intention. Often it's about money. Often they don't quite understand what it is they're doing. They don't have the conception of it that we have. So I think I've spouted on at you enough. So my thinking is, having looked at this and thinking about my daughter, I think this is a really difficult theme to teach. I think you're asking a lot. You're asking a lot of your pupils and yourselves to do it. It's difficult to approach the exam questions and it's difficult to find resources. But there are really interesting changes that have gone on in modern scholarship, in the last 20, 30 years. Our understanding of women in medieval life, our understanding of feudalism, of religious life, and also of government and power is being transformed just now. And also there are really interesting resources out there that you can make use of.